Your grandfather didn't meal prep. He didn't count macros. He didn't order anything from anywhere. When the food ran out, he figured it out because that's what men did. These 25 foods kept the toughest humans who ever walked this continent alive through winters that would end most people today before February. And somewhere deep down, you already know every single one of them. Number 25, pemmican. Long before protein bars, there was pemmican. The mountain men considered it the single most reliable food a person could carry into the wilderness, and they were right. Made from dried meat, rendered fat, and dried berries, it packed more calories per ounce than almost anything else a man could fit in his pack. They learned to make it from the Plains Indians, who had perfected the recipe over generations. Lean meat, most often bison or deer, was sliced thin and dried until it crumbled at the touch, then pounded into powder and blended with an equal weight of hot rendered fat, usually tallow from the same animal. The finished product was shaped into dense cakes that hardened as they cooled and lasted for years without spoiling. A single pound sustained a man through a full day of hard travel, crossing frozen rivers, setting trap lines in temperatures that froze the breath before it left the mouth, hauling pelts across terrain that had no mercy for the unprepared. It did not require cooking. It asked nothing of you except that you eat it. In return, it kept you alive. Number 24, hardtack. It had the texture of a roof tile and the flavor of damp chalk, and mountain men ate it by the pound. Hardtack was the great equalizer of frontier survival, cheap to make, impossible to destroy, and available to anyone with a handful of flour and a fire. The recipe had not changed in centuries. Mix flour with just enough water to form a stiff dough, press it flat, punch holes through it with a knife point, and bake it until every trace of moisture has been driven out completely. What remained was a dense, bone-dry cracker that survived months in a leather saddlebag without going bad. Men soaked it in water or coffee to soften it, crumbled it into stews to give them body, or gnawed it raw, straight from the pack. Trappers wintering alone in the high country carried sacks of hardtack as their emergency reserve, the food they fell back on when the hunting went cold and the traps came up empty. It was never anyone's first choice. But it was always there, and in the wilderness, being always there was worth more than being delicious. Number 23, rendered bear fat. When a mountain man killed a bear, the meat was welcome, but the fat was the real prize. Bear grease was everything on the frontier: cooking oil, waterproofing for leather, protection for iron traps against rust, skin salve for wounds and frostbite, and one of the highest calorie substances a man could consume when the cold closed in and his body demanded fuel just to keep his blood warm. Rendering it was careful work. Raw fat was cut from the carcass and melted slowly over a low fire. Impurities skimmed away until nothing remained but pure, clean grease that cooled into a firm, white solid. It kept for months in sealed clay pots or animal bladders. A man who had a good supply of bear fat going into winter felt considerably better about his chances than one who did not. Mixed with dried meat, baked into cornbread, or spread across hardtack to make it both edible and calorie-dense, rendered bear fat was survival food that made no apologies. The men who lived on it were not eating poorly. They were eating with the precise understanding that in the wilderness, fat is warmth, and warmth is life. Number 22, parched corn. Parched corn was one of the oldest survival foods in North America, used by indigenous peoples for centuries before the first European trapper crossed the Appalachians. Mountain men adopted it immediately because it was everything a man alone in the wilderness needed his food to be: light, durable, calorie-dense, and simple enough to prepare that no fire was required at all. The process was straightforward. Dried kernels went into a dry pan over hot coals and were stirred constantly until they turned golden and gave off a faint nutty smell. Once cooled, parched corn went into a cloth sack and could be eaten by the handful over days or weeks without further preparation. Some men ground it coarse and mixed the meal with water into a rough porridge. Others ate it whole, chewing slowly. An experienced trapper heading into unfamiliar country carried several pounds of parched corn as insurance food that weighed almost nothing, needed nothing from him, and would keep him moving when everything else had run out. It was frontier practicality reduced to its simplest possible form, and men trusted it with their lives for generations. Number 21, bison jerky. The American bison was the engine of the entire frontier economy, and for the men who lived in bison country, it was the foundation of their diet. Fresh meat was welcome, but fresh meat spoiled quickly, and a man alone in the back country could not afford to waste what he had killed. The solution was jerky, and nobody made it better or needed it more urgently than the frontiersmen of the 1800s. Bison jerky was made by slicing meat into long, thin strips, rubbing those strips with salt when salt was available, and hanging them to dry in the sun or over a slow smoke. The finished product was tough, intensely flavored, and nothing like the processed versions sold in gas stations today. A single bison could yield enough jerky to keep a man fed for months, and it survived a full summer in a saddlebag without spoiling. Mountain men traveling between trapping grounds or returning from a season in the high country carried bundles of bison jerky as their primary food supply. They ate it while walking, while riding, while repairing gear, while waiting at the fire for the cold to ease. It was the food of constant motion of men who had places to be and no time to stop. Number 20, beaver tail. Beaver tail was not something you stumbled upon accidentally. It was the deliberate reward claimed by the men who spent their lives in the cold streams and rivers of the American West, setting and pulling trap lines in water that would kill an unprepared man in minutes. For the trappers who hunted beaver for the fur trade, the tail was a luxury rich, fatty, earned through hard work in miserable conditions. The tail is covered in thick, scaly skin that must be held over fire until it blisters and peels away cleanly. What is left underneath is an extraordinary piece of meat, pale, gelatinous, shot through with fat in a way that no other cut of any other animal quite replicates. Roasted over coals and eaten hot, it delivered a richness that every veteran of the fur trade recognized immediately as the kind of fuel their bodies had been asking for all season. Many frontiersmen considered it among the finest meals the wilderness had to offer. Accounts written by trappers and explorers returned to beaver tail again and again with a fondness that most people reserve for their grandmother's kitchen. It was not survival food eaten out of desperation. It was celebration food, eaten at the end of a good trapping day, around a fire that felt, for a few hours, like civilization itself. Number 19, blood soup. Nothing was wasted. That was not a philosophy for the mountain men. It was an iron rule of survival. When a deer or elk came down, the blood came with it, and men who had lived long enough in the wilderness knew exactly what to do with it. Blood soup was made directly at the kill site when possible, while the carcass was still warm. Some men carried small iron pots specifically for this purpose. The blood was collected and brought to a boil, then thickened with whatever was at hand, dried cornmeal, strips of fat, pieces of offal, and seasoned with salt or wild herbs when available. The result was dark, rich, deeply savory, and it tasted of iron and wild meat and the particular satisfaction of a successful hunt. To modern sensibilities, blood soup is an unfamiliar idea. To a man who had been living on hardtack and parched corn for 2 weeks in the high country, the iron and protein in fresh blood were more than nutrients. They were the body receiving exactly what it had been desperately asking for, and men who understood this wasted not a single drop. Number 18, pine bark. When the hunting failed, the stores ran low, and a man was days from any settlement with weather closing in, the wilderness itself became the pantry. One of the most overlooked survival foods in the frontier canon was the inner bark of the pine tree, the soft, pale layer just beneath the rough outer bark, which can be stripped away in long ribbons and eaten raw, dried, or boiled into a crude but genuinely nutritious meal. Mountain men learned this from indigenous guides and from hard experience. The inner bark of certain pine species contains sugars, starches, and enough calories to keep a man functional when nothing else is available. Boiled until soft, it produced a thick, sticky paste that tasted faintly of resin, not pleasant by any measure, but edible. And edibility was the only qualification that mattered when the alternative was starvation. Men who wintered alone in remote mountain cabins kept this knowledge as an emergency reserve. That they knew it at all speaks to the depth of preparation that survival in the wilderness required. The frontier did not forgive ignorance. Men who lived in it long enough learned to eat what it offered, on its terms, without complaint. Number 17, cornmeal mush. If pemmican was the king of trail food and hardtack its grim lieutenant, cornmeal mush was the steady, unglamorous backbone of camp cooking in the American wilderness. Nothing more than ground corn, water, and a fire. Ready in 15 minutes, filling in 5. For men who spent most of their lives in conditions where simplicity was not a preference but a necessity, cornmeal mush appeared on the menu with a regularity that bordered on the devotional. Ground cornmeal was poured slowly into boiling water and stirred continuously to prevent scorching, then cooked until it thickened to porridge. Eaten hot from the pot, it was warming and filling. Allowed to cool and harden, it could be sliced and fried in bare fat until the outside turned golden and crisp, producing something considerably more satisfying than its ingredient list suggested it had any right to be. Mountain men customized their mush with whatever was on hand: dried berries pressed in during cooking, a strip of salt pork rendered down into the pot, a handful of dried meat crumbled across the top. It adapted to what you had. What you had was rarely much. It fed them anyway. Number 16, elk, heart, and liver. A man who killed an elk in the backcountry had decisions to make quickly. The animal weighed several hundred pounds, and he could not take all of it. The meat could be dried or frozen. But the organs were perishable and had to be dealt with immediately. Mountain men dealt with them in the most direct way possible. They cooked them on the spot and ate them at the kill. Elk heart and liver were sliced thick, thrown directly onto coals or into a pan with hot grease, and cooked just long enough to set the outside while the inside stayed pink. Eaten immediately while the body heat of the animal still lingered in the meat, this was one of the most intensely nourishing meals available anywhere on the frontier, dense with iron, fat-soluble vitamins, and a deep mineral richness that no amount of dried trail food could replicate. There is a reason nearly every indigenous culture across North America reserved the organs for the hunters who had made the kill. It was not ceremony for its own sake, it was biology. After the expenditure of energy required to track, kill, and dress a large animal in rugged terrain, the body of a hunter is depleted in specific ways that organ meat replenishes with extraordinary efficiency. Mountain men did not know the biochemistry. They knew the feeling. After eating liver at the kill, a man felt ready to walk another 20 miles. Number 15, service berries. A man who ate nothing but meat for weeks at a stretch understood the particular physical longing for anything green, anything sweet, anything that tasted of the living world. Service berries, called Saskatoons across the northern range, were one of the most reliable answers to that longing. Ripe in early summer, growing in dense clusters along creek banks and open hillsides across the west, they were sweet, nutritious, and available in quantities large enough to matter. Mountain men ate them fresh by the handful when in season, with the cheerful efficiency of men who had been eating dried and salted food for weeks and had forgotten what sweetness tasted like. Dried in the sun, they could be stored for months and carried on the trail, providing a concentrated source of sugar and natural compounds that the body needed during long stretches of meat-only eating. They were also a critical ingredient in the finest pemmican. Plains tribes mixed dried service berries into pemmican in generous quantities, so that the finished product carried a slight sweetness, a small concession to pleasure, in an otherwise purely functional food that made the long miles just slightly more bearable. Small improvements to a hard life are not small at all. Mountain men understood this completely. Number 14, roasted grouse. The ruffed grouse was the mountain man's best friend in lean times. Found throughout the forested regions where trappers worked, it was slow enough to kill with a well-thrown stone in a pinch, dressed out in minutes, and cooked in the time it took to get a fire to a good working temperature. When big game was scarce and a man's stores were running low, grouse kept him fed. Preparation was brutally simple. The bird was plucked or skinned on the spot, split along the breastbone, pressed flat, and suspended from a stick above the fire. The modest fat in the breast rendered out slowly as it cooked, basting the meat as it went. A large grouse produced enough for a decent meal, and a man good with a sling or a small-bore rifle could take several in a morning without ranging far from camp. Men learned to move through grouse country differently, slowly, quietly, watching the ground under dense conifer stands where the birds liked to feed. A grouse was never the meal a man wanted it to be. It was never the elk or the bison that could solve a week's worth of hunger at once, but it was the meal that appeared when those larger animals did not. In the wilderness, the meal that appeared was always the right one. Number 13, wild onions. Wild onions were added to everything. Found growing in dense clumps along stream banks, in mountain meadows, and wherever the soil stayed moist through the dry season, they were recognized by every experienced frontiersman for exactly what they were: flavor, nutrition, and a reminder that the wilderness did not offer only suffering to those willing to look carefully. Chopped roughly and thrown into the pot with whatever meat or mush was cooking, they transformed a plain camp meal into something that tasted intentional. Eaten raw alongside jerky, they cut through the salt and fat with a welcome sharpness. Roasted whole in the coals until soft and sweet, they were a side dish good enough to eat as the main event. Beyond flavor, wild onions provided vitamin C in useful quantities, compounds that support digestion and circulation, and minerals that a man working hard in cold conditions burns through quickly. Mountain men did not know the biochemistry, but they felt the difference that green food made, and they stopped for wild onions whenever they found them, with the unhurried deliberateness of men who recognize that small gifts from the wilderness deserve to be accepted. Number 12. Snowshoe hare. Snowshoe hares were the most abundant large prey animal in the boreal forests and mountain ranges where trappers spent their winters, and in good years a skilled man could find them everywhere. Tracks, crossing tracks in the snow, the entire landscape written in the language of small, fast animals moving through the dark. A skilled man could snare dozens in a single night. Snowshoe hare is famously lean, almost no fat on the carcass, which created a specific problem for men trying to survive on it as a sole food source. Rabbit starvation, the condition that results from eating only lean protein with no fat, was a genuine threat in deep winter, and mountain men learned to guard against it by rendering every scrap of fat from other sources and adding it to hare stews and soups. Without fat supplementation, eating nothing but hare in winter would slowly kill you just as surely as eating nothing at all. When supplemented properly, hare was an excellent wilderness food, delicate in flavor, quick to cook, available without the enormous expenditure of energy that larger game demanded. A man who kept his snare lines running and his fat stores replenished could live on snowshoe hare through a long winter. Many did. They came out in the spring thin and capable and ready to do it again. Number 11. Dutch oven biscuits. Not every mountain man traveled light by necessity. The fur trading companies that provisioned their trapping brigades included the Dutch oven, a heavy cast iron pot with a tight-fitting lid, nested in coals and covered with more coals on top as standard equipment, and it was among the most valued items in any outfit. With a Dutch oven and a sack of flour, a man could produce real biscuits in camp. The recipe was simple. Flour, a pinch of salt, a spoonful of lard or bear fat, worked in until the texture turned crumbly, then just enough water to bring the dough together without making it sticky. Pressed into rounds, arranged in the greased pot, covered, surrounded by coals. 20 minutes later, something appeared that looked and smelled and tasted like civilization. Golden outside, tender inside, warm all the way through. Men who had been eating cold pemmican and hardtack for weeks reacted to a fresh biscuit the way a man lost at sea reacts to a sail on the horizon. It was a reminder of home, of mothers and wives and tables set properly, and it did things for a man's will to continue that no amount of calories alone could accomplish. The frontier was not only a test of physical endurance, it was a test of the will to keep going. Good food, when it appeared, maintained that will in ways that mattered enormously.